We got used to consuming other people's tragedies like premium entertainment. A dark story, a bowl of popcorn, a Netflix series, and suddenly an entire country becomes a stylish spectacle for the rest of the world. For millions of Western viewers, Colombia turned into a brand. Exotic streets, tropical music, beautiful women, dangerous men with charisma, coffee plantations under the hot sun. Drug lords turned into pop culture icons. People watch crime dramas and secretly admire the smugglers. They wear t-shirts with the faces of dead cartel bosses. They dream about visiting Cartagena, drinking expensive coffee and walking through colorful colonial streets while imagining scenes from Narcos. But reality punishes that kind of blindness very quickly. The real Colombia is not a Hollywood script where the villain dies dramatically on a rooftop and the credits start rolling with upbeat music. The real Colombia is an open wound that never stopped bleeding. A country exhausted by fear, corruption, and violence that became normal long ago. You land in Bogotá, and the fantasy disappears almost immediately. The heavy, humid air hits your lungs. It doesn't smell like fresh coffee. It smells like exhaust fumes, cheap fried food, old motorcycles, and constant anxiety. That anxiety is everywhere. For the comfortable Western audience, cartel stories are entertainment for a quiet evening. For millions of ordinary Colombians, it is daily life. The old drug empires never truly disappeared. They simply evolved. The flashy criminals with gold chains and private zoos were replaced by businessmen in expensive suits. The violence became quieter, smarter, harder to see. Huge parts of the country still live outside real government control. Armed groups, cartels, and illegal militias continue running entire territories. Families flee villages just to stop their sons from being recruited into armed organizations. Entire generations grew up surrounded by a conflict that never fully ended. Meanwhile, the world keeps romanticizing the chaos. People drink Colombian coffee and praise the country's resilience, but rarely think about the price ordinary people pay to keep that beautiful image alive. Behind the tourist brochures and colorful Instagram photos hides a nation carrying decades of trauma. And every morning, millions of Colombians wake up with one simple hope: just survive until nightfall. When the famous mustached drug lord was killed on a rooftop in Medellin more than 30 years ago, the world celebrated like evil itself had finally been defeated. Politicians gave speeches about victory. Generals received medals. Tourists arrived to buy cheap souvenirs and take photos in places that used to be war zones. But underneath all the headlines and celebrations, the real system survived. The cartels never disappeared. They just became invisible. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, drug lords were loud, arrogant, and obsessed with attention. They blew up airplanes, assassinated presidential candidates, and built luxury prisons for themselves. They wanted the whole world to fear them. Today's criminal empires work differently. Modern cartel leaders don't look like gangsters anymore. They look like successful executives. They wear tailored suits, speak perfect English, and run international companies. In Colombia, some people quietly call them Los Invisibles, the Invisibles. You could sit next to one of them in a luxury restaurant in Bogotá and never realize that the polite man drinking wine beside you controls tons of cocaine moving through the Pacific Ocean right now. The old cartels fought wars against the government. The new cartels prefer buying pieces of the system instead. Meanwhile, the drug business itself became larger than ever. Coca plantations in regions like Catatumbo and Putumayo now cover massive areas of jungle. New coca plant varieties produce more harvests every year. Hidden laboratories sit deep under rainforest cover where satellites struggle to detect them. Drugs leave the country through homemade submarines built inside mangrove swamps or hidden inside perfectly legal shipments of bananas and avocados heading toward Europe and North America. But the darkest transformation happened inside Colombia itself. In the past, cocaine was mainly an export product for wealthy consumers abroad. Now criminal groups realized they could also profit from destroying their own population. Poor neighborhoods became flooded with cheap toxic drugs like bazuco. It rots people from the inside out. Entire communities are collapsing under addiction, violence, and despair. Street gangs operate like small local franchises connected to larger criminal organizations. They collect extortion money from everyone: taxi drivers, food vendors, shop owners, barbers. That money is called la vacuna, the vaccine against death. If somebody refuses to pay, they often disappear by the next morning. Entire cities are now divided by invisible borders. Local residents instinctively know where those borders begin and end. A teenager can be killed simply for crossing into the wrong neighborhood to visit a friend or buy bread. The government still performs anti-drug operations for television cameras. Police arrest small dealers. Soldiers burn jungle laboratories. But the drug economy already spread too deeply into the bloodstream of the country. Real estate, construction, politics, business, everything became contaminated. And that is the moment when the illusion completely falls apart. Because the monster everyone thought was dead didn't vanish at all. It simply learned how to smile, wear a tie, and operate in silence. The modern world loves talking about equality. Politicians speak about human rights, fairness, and opportunity for everyone. Social media is filled with slogans about inclusion and progress. But in the middle of South America, there is a country where social division became so deeply normalized that it is literally built into everyday life. Colombia works like a giant 6-floor building, and almost nobody can change floors. The system is called estratos. Officially, it was created as a social support mechanism. Wealthier neighborhoods would pay more for utilities like electricity and water, so poorer communities could pay less. On paper, it sounded reasonable and compassionate. In reality, it evolved into something far darker: a rigid social caste system disguised as urban planning. The country is divided into 6 official levels. Estrato 1 and 2 represent extreme poverty. Estrato 6 is the protected world of the elite, and between those extremes stands an invisible wall stronger than almost any physical border. Your address decides your future before you even become an adult. Poor neighborhoods climb up steep hillsides in endless rows of unfinished brick houses, metal roofs, and broken streets. People wake up before sunrise and spend hours inside overcrowded buses just to reach low-paying jobs cleaning offices, carrying cargo, or serving wealthier Colombians. In many of these areas, proper sewage systems barely exist. Ambulances arrive late or not at all. Police often avoid entering without armored support. Meanwhile, the upper classes live inside another reality entirely. High walls, private security, electric fences, luxury towers, private schools, helicopters used to avoid traffic, shopping malls that look exactly like Miami or Dubai. These two Colombias exist side by side, but they rarely touch each other. A wealthy person from Estrato 6 almost never enters the slums because they fear them. A poor person from Estrato 1 usually enters elite neighborhoods only through service entrances. And that is the real diagnosis of Colombia. Not simply drugs, not simply violence. The country functions like a broken elevator. Millions of people are trapped on the lower floors, while a protected minority lives safely above them. And the longer this system survives, the harder it becomes to move upward. Your neighborhood affects almost everything: where you study, who you meet, what opportunities you receive. Even employers quietly judge people based on their home address. The moment someone sees a resume from a poor district, assumptions are immediately made. Talent matters less than background. And over time, that destroys hope. Young people from poor communities quickly learn a brutal lesson. Honest work often leads nowhere. They see their parents exhausting themselves for tiny salaries while still struggling to afford food, healthcare, or safety. Then they look at criminals. The gangs have money. The gangs have respect. The gangs offer power. Suddenly, crime stops looking immoral and starts looking practical. That is why cartels and street gangs never run out of recruits. In a closed system where legal success feels unreachable, organized crime becomes one of the only functioning social elevators left. Even the middle class lives in fear. People work constantly while worrying that one crisis, one medical emergency, or one lost job could push them into poverty. The pressure never fully disappears. The entire country feels like a giant pressure cooker. Below, millions of exhausted people are tired of being invisible. Tired of carrying the economy on their backs while watching wealth they will never touch. Tired of surviving inside neighborhoods abandoned by the state. Above, the elite hide behind gates, cameras, and armed guards pretending the crisis outside their walls can remain contained forever. But no society can remain divided like this indefinitely. Because eventually, fear changes direction. At first, poor communities fear the rich system that excludes them. Then one day the wealthy begin fearing the people below. And once a country reaches that stage, stability becomes extremely fragile. That is exactly where Colombia stands today. A nation suspended between luxury and desperation, connected by a broken elevator that almost nobody believes will ever work again. The world loves telling the story of Medellin as if it were a modern miracle. Urban planners, journalists, and Western influencers constantly repeat the same narrative. The city transformed itself from the murder capital of the world into a shining example of innovation and social recovery. Governments proudly showcase cable cars floating above poor neighborhoods. They point to modern libraries, giant outdoor escalators, and colorful street art painted across former war zones. Tourists arrive excited to experience the new Medellin. They ride through the hills taking photos from clean glass cabins while staring down at endless rows of brick houses stacked across the mountainsides. From above, it looks inspiring, hopeful, almost futuristic. But that image only works from a distance, because Medellin did not erase its violence. It learned how to hide it. Foreign visitors walk through places like Comuna 13, surrounded by smiling guides, hip-hop dancers, and souvenir shops. They drink local beer, take pictures beside murals, and listen to stories about transformation and peace. For a few hours, everything feels safe and controlled. It feels like the city defeated its past. But walk just a few streets away from those tourist corridors, and the illusion begins collapsing immediately. The polished narrative ends exactly where the cameras stop filming. Behind the colorful murals and tourist attractions, another Medellin still exists. A city where armed street gangs continue controlling entire neighborhoods. A city divided by invisible borders that locals learn to recognize from childhood. Residents know exactly which streets are safe and which ones can get you killed. A teenager can be murdered simply for crossing into the wrong area to visit a friend, attend school, or buy food. Mothers panic when their children travel through territories controlled by rival groups. One wrong turn can become fatal. The gangs operating there, known locally as combos, never disappeared after the government reforms. They simply adapted. They stopped attracting unnecessary attention and became more organized, quieter, and smarter. Today, many of these groups function like highly efficient local corporations. They control extortion, drug distribution, illegal loans, transportation, neighborhood security. and sometimes even local disputes between residents. The government controls the metro stations and tourist routes. The gangs control much of everything behind them. Every small business pays protection money. Bakeries, bus drivers, street food vendors, barbershops, tiny grocery stores. Everyone pays what criminals call la vacuna, the vaccine against death. If someone refuses to pay, their business may burn down overnight. Sometimes the owner disappears with it. Official statistics claim violence dropped dramatically. Politicians use those numbers to market Medellin as a global model for urban recovery. International conferences praise the city. Architects receive awards. Foreign media celebrates the success story. But many locals quietly understand something outsiders do not. Part of the peace came from silent agreements. The gangs realized that constant public bloodshed damages business. Too many murders scare away tourists, investors, and international attention. So instead of eliminating violence, many groups simply changed how violence operates. Kill more quietly, hide the bodies better, avoid large public wars. The numbers improve, the fear remains. In the hills surrounding Medellin, there are hidden mass graves where missing people vanish forever. Families spend years searching for sons, brothers, and fathers who never came home. Many cases are barely investigated because exposing the full scale of disappearances would destroy the carefully constructed image of the city's miracle recovery. The government needs hope to sell. It needs investment. It needs tourism. It needs the world to believe the war ended. But for many ordinary residents, the rules of survival never changed. Stay quiet. Avoid attention. Know which streets belong to whom. Never ask too many questions. And Medellin is only one example. Outside the major tourist cities, the situation becomes even darker. In remote regions like Choco, Arauca, and Putumayo, the Colombian state barely exists at all. There are huge territories where government authority is almost meaningless. Hospitals are rare. Roads are broken or non-existent. Police stations are isolated bunkers surrounded by sandbags. Power belongs to whoever carries the biggest rifle. Guerrilla groups, cartel militias, and armed factions control enormous rural areas. They collect taxes, decide punishments, and operate entire underground economies based on drugs, illegal mining, and smuggling routes. In 2016, the Colombian government signed a historic peace agreement with the largest guerrilla army in the region. The world celebrated. International leaders applauded. News outlets declared that decades of conflict were finally ending. But the reality inside the countryside looked very different. Many older rebel commanders entered politics and abandoned open warfare. Yet the territories they left behind were immediately occupied by younger, hungrier, and even more ruthless armed groups. The war did not disappear. It fragmented. Now multiple factions fight constantly for control over coca plantations, illegal gold mines, and jungle smuggling routes. Ordinary farmers became trapped between them. If a family lives inside territory controlled by one armed faction, rival groups automatically consider them enemies. Neutrality becomes impossible. Entire villages survive under permanent fear. And because the government presence is so weak, armed groups effectively replace the state itself. They build dirt roads, they collect taxes, they settle disputes, they decide punishments. If someone steals livestock or causes conflict inside a village, there may be no judge, no lawyer, and no police officer. There is only a man with an assault rifle delivering a decision in 5 minutes. And those decisions often end with executions. Children growing up in these regions learn one terrifying lesson very early. Real power comes from weapons, not laws, not education, not institutions, weapons. That is why recruitment into armed groups never truly stops. Teenagers disappear into the jungle, carrying oversized rifles and heavy backpacks full of cocaine. Some are barely 13 years old. For them, there are no universities, no career opportunities, and no functioning social mobility. Only two choices: poverty on a dying farm, or status inside a violent organization. Meanwhile, the government continues launching dramatic military operations for television cameras. Helicopters arrive deep in the jungle. Soldiers burn abandoned drug labs. Officials pose for photographs beside captured weapons. Then the army leaves, and as soon as the helicopters disappear, the armed groups return. Everything resets. The cycle continues. That is the real failure of the Colombian system. Not just corruption, not just narcotics. A state too weak to control its territory and too accustomed to coexisting with organized crime. Over time, violence stopped being a temporary emergency. It became infrastructure, an invisible system woven directly into politics, economics, and everyday survival. And once an entire country adapts itself around violence for long enough, something extremely dangerous happens. People stop believing change is even possible anymore. Western tourists love talking about Latin American optimism. They buy fruit from a street vendor in Bogota or Cali, see a tired smile on his face, and immediately turn it into some beautiful life lesson about happiness and simplicity. They write long social media posts saying people here may be poor, but they know how to enjoy life. That is one of the most dishonest romantic myths outsiders keep repeating. Because that smile is usually not happiness. It is survival. It is the automatic expression of someone trying to make it through one more exhausting day. In Colombia, there is a word that explains this reality perfectly: el rebusque. Economists describe it as the informal economy, but on the streets the meaning is far more brutal. It means waking up every morning with no idea whether you will earn enough money to eat tonight. Millions of Colombians live exactly like that. No contracts, no healthcare, no paid vacations, no job security, no safety net, only endless improvisation. If you do not go out and work today, your children may go to bed hungry tonight. The state offers almost no protection for huge parts of the population, so people invent work out of thin air. Men sell single cigarettes because customers cannot afford full packs. Elderly people rent out cell phones by the minute on busy sidewalks. Women fry arepas beside highways filled with toxic exhaust fumes. Children clean car windows at red lights while dodging buses and motorcycles. An entire society survives one day at a time, and every year it becomes harder. Inflation keeps eating away at what little people earn. Rice, cooking oil, beans, and transportation grow more expensive while incomes remain trapped in the past. Many families are already balancing on the edge of collapse. Then another trap appears: gota a gota, drop by drop. One of the cruelest debt systems in Latin America. Criminal lenders offer small emergency loans without paperwork or bank approval. For desperate people, it looks like salvation. But the interest rates are insane, and payments must be made daily. Miss one payment and men on motorcycles arrive at your door. They threaten families, break bones, destroy businesses, confiscate carts and merchandise. Sometimes they simply make people disappear. Entire families become trapped inside debts they can never realistically escape. It is modern slavery disguised as microfinance. And the worst part is that millions of people have no alternative. Politicians constantly describe these struggling workers as entrepreneurs. They use fashionable language about flexibility, hustle culture, and self-employment. But there is nothing empowering about a 70-year-old man pushing a cart of cardboard uphill for 14 hours a day under heavy rain. That is not freedom. That is exhaustion turned into economic policy. Authorities regularly launch crackdowns against street vendors because they damage the image of the city. Police officers throw fruit onto the pavement, confiscate merchandise, and fine women who are simply trying to feed their children. The same state that failed to provide stable jobs punishes people for trying to survive without them. And while daily life was already collapsing for poor Colombians, another crisis exploded across the eastern border. Venezuela collapsed. Millions of desperate migrants flooded into Colombia, searching for food, work, and safety. It became one of the largest migration waves in modern South American history. Entire families walked for weeks through mountains, highways, and illegal jungle paths known as trocas. They carried children on their backs. They slept under bridges. They crossed freezing mountain passes at night. Most believed they were escaping hell. Instead, many entered another form of suffering. Colombia tried to absorb the migration wave, but the country already struggled to support its own population. Public hospitals became overcrowded. Free schools ran out of space. Poor neighborhoods filled beyond capacity. And slowly, resentment began boiling. Many Colombians living near poverty started seeing Venezuelan migrants as direct competition. Refugees accepted lower wages for construction jobs, cleaning work, and manual labor simply because they were desperate to survive. The word Veneco turned into a slur. Tensions exploded in poor districts. Fights broke out. Violence increased. It became a brutal war between the poor and the absolutely desperate. Meanwhile, criminal organizations immediately recognized an opportunity. The migrants became a massive source of cheap, vulnerable labor. Young men were recruited into gangs and smuggling operations. Women disappeared into prostitution networks. Teenagers carried cocaine through the jungle for tiny amounts of money. And if they vanished, almost nobody investigated, because undocumented refugees are nearly invisible inside a collapsing system. But daily life in Colombia collapses in another disturbing way, too, through beauty. The country developed an extreme obsession with physical appearance, especially in poorer communities. Narco culture left behind a toxic message that spread deeply across society. Beauty can function as social mobility. Young girls grow up surrounded by images of cartel girlfriends, beauty queens, and influencers with exaggerated plastic surgery. Many quickly learn that education may not lift them out of poverty, but their bodies might. Families living in slums sometimes take out dangerous loans just to pay for cosmetic procedures for teenage daughters. Breast implants, body shaping, lip injections, anything that might help them attract wealthier men or enter a better social class. But proper surgery costs money most poor families will never have. So underground clinics exploded across the country. Garages, dirty apartments, basements, fake cosmetic specialists inject industrial silicone, cooking oil, and toxic chemicals directly into women's bodies. For a short time, the illusion works. Some women gain money, status, or connections. Then the nightmare begins. The substances slowly destroy living tissue. Skin blackens. Chronic pain spreads through the body. Limbs become infected. Some women require amputations just to survive. Public hospitals are filled with victims of illegal cosmetic procedures. And still the industry keeps growing. Because once a society destroys normal paths upward, the human body itself becomes a survival tool. That is what Colombia slowly turned into. A place where work no longer guarantees dignity. Education no longer guarantees opportunity. Honesty no longer guarantees safety. So millions of people survive by selling whatever they still can. Their labor, their youth, their beauty, or their desperation. And once an entire nation begins functioning like that, everyday life stops feeling like life at all. It becomes a permanent endurance test, a slow-motion collapse where people are not truly living anymore. They are simply trying not to sink first. The most uncomfortable question in this entire story is also the most important one. Who actually destroyed Colombia? People want a simple answer. They want one clear villain: the cartels, corrupt politicians, guerrillas, America, poverty. But the truth is far uglier, because responsibility is spread across too many hands. Colombia became trapped inside a system where almost everybody profits from the chaos, except ordinary people. Yes, the cartels caused unimaginable damage. They flooded the country with violence, corruption, and fear. Entire generations grew up surrounded by murder, kidnappings, and extortion. But criminal organizations did not appear from nowhere. They grew because the state left enormous empty spaces behind. For decades, huge parts of Colombia were abandoned. No proper roads, no hospitals, no functioning schools, no real economic opportunities. In many rural areas, the only people offering jobs, money, or protection were armed groups. And whenever the government disappears, somebody else always replaces it. In Colombia, that replacement came carrying rifles. Corruption made everything even worse. Regional politicians quickly realized that cooperating with criminal networks was often more profitable than fighting them. Mayors, police officers, judges, and military officials accepted cartel money. Some did it out of fear, others did it out of greed. Eventually, corruption became so normal that the line between authority and organized crime started disappearing altogether. Ordinary people understood the message very quickly. The law protects the powerful. Everyone else survives alone. Meanwhile, outside Colombia, wealthy countries helped fuel the disaster from another direction, especially the United States and Europe. For decades, Western governments demanded an aggressive war on drugs. Billions of dollars were spent on military operations, helicopters, surveillance systems, and anti-narcotics campaigns. Politicians constantly talked about fighting organized crime and protecting global security. But at the exact same time, millions of people in those same countries continued buying cocaine every weekend. That money flowed directly back into cartel networks. This is the central hypocrisy of the entire system. The world demands that Colombia stop producing drugs while continuing to create enormous demand for them. As long as rich consumers keep paying, somebody will always supply the product, and the profits are too massive to resist. A poor farmer growing legal crops deep in the jungle earns almost nothing. Coca cultivation offers far more money in regions where almost no other economic opportunities exist. Armed groups understand this perfectly. That is why they protect coca plantations and violently defend drug routes. Over time, cocaine stopped being just a criminal product. It became part of the economic bloodstream of entire regions. Construction, transportation, real estate, trade. Huge amounts of illegal money quietly entered legal industries. But there is another major force responsible for Colombia's collapse: extreme inequality. A deeply divided society eventually becomes unstable, no matter how modern it looks on the surface. Colombia's elites spent decades protecting themselves behind walls, private security, and isolated luxury neighborhoods, while millions of people remained trapped in hopeless poverty. Wealthy families could escape much of the country's instability by paying for private schools, private healthcare, and private security. Poor communities had no such protection. The message became brutally clear. The system was never designed equally. That realization slowly destroys trust inside a society. People stop believing in institutions, stop believing in justice, stop believing that hard work leads anywhere. And once hope disappears, crime starts looking rational. But even this explanation is still incomplete, because the international entertainment industry also carries responsibility. The world turned Colombian suffering into a profitable global product. TV series, documentaries, narco-tourism, souvenirs. Tourists now travel to Medellin specifically searching for cartel experiences. They pose beside murals of dead criminals, visit former safe houses, and listen to stories about violence while drinking cocktails. The tragedy became marketable, and that creates another dangerous effect. Young people growing up in poor neighborhoods constantly see cartel figures transformed into cultural icons. Television made many drug lords look powerful, fearless, and glamorous instead of pathetic and destructive. Violence became aesthetic. Criminals became legends. But responsibility also exists inside Colombian society itself. Decades of fear permanently changed how people think. Entire generations learned to stay silent in order to survive. They became used to corruption, extortion, and violence as part of normal life. This does not mean Colombians are naturally violent people. It means people adapt psychologically to whatever environment they survive inside. When children grow up hearing gunfire for years, their definition of normal changes completely. Death stops shocking them. Corruption stops surprising them. Fear becomes routine, and eventually, an entire nation develops moral exhaustion. People stop thinking collectively. They stop believing sacrifice will improve the future. Survival becomes individual. Protect your family. Protect your neighborhood. Protect yourself. That fragmentation weakens society even further. Meanwhile, politicians continue making dramatic promises during every election cycle. They speak about peace, reform, and national recovery, but many of them depend on the same corrupt networks they publicly claim to oppose, and so the cycle continues. The poor remain trapped. The gangs keep recruiting. The cartels keep exporting. Foreign consumers keep buying. Politicians keep promising. Ordinary people keep burying relatives. That is the real horror of Colombia. There is no single monster behind the disaster. There is an enormous machine where too many pieces work together. Criminal organizations make billions. Corrupt officials protect themselves. Rich countries consume the product. Tourists consume the myth. And ordinary Colombians pay the full price every single day. There is something even more disturbing than Colombia's present reality, and that is the future slowly forming in front of it, because countries can survive corruption, violence, and deep poverty for a long time, but there comes a point where accumulated damage starts breaking the foundation itself, and Colombia is dangerously close to that point. The first major threat is exhaustion. People are simply tired, not mildly tired, but deeply, generationally exhausted. Decades of conflict, broken promises, insecurity, and inequality have drained public trust almost completely. Large parts of the population no longer believe in institutions. They don't believe politicians. They don't believe the police. And many don't even believe change is realistically possible anymore. When a society stays in that mental state long enough, something dangerous happens. Violence stops shocking people. Massacres become background noise. Death becomes routine. And when that shift happens, society begins to psychologically break. Younger generations grow up assuming corruption is normal and survival is personal responsibility rather than a shared social system. Many young people no longer dream of improving the country. They dream of leaving it. That leads to another silent collapse: brain drain. Thousands of the most educated and capable Colombians leave whenever they get the chance. Doctors, engineers, researchers, and students choose emigration instead of staying inside a system that feels stuck and unsafe. The country steadily loses exactly the people it needs most to rebuild itself. At the same time, criminal organizations continue recruiting from the poorest sectors with zero difficulty. The gap keeps widening every year. But social exhaustion is only one layer. There is also a structural economic fragility growing underneath everyday life. Millions of people survive inside unstable, informal economies with no protection. A serious financial shock, inflation spike, or global recession could trigger mass collapse in many urban areas almost instantly. Most households live with no savings, no backup plan, no institutional support, so even small crises become existential threats. Recent mass protests showed another reality. The country is filled with accumulated anger. Young people went to the streets demanding jobs, education, and basic dignity. But many protests ended with police violence, tear gas, and confrontation. Each clash deepens mistrust further. Colombia now stands between two unstable forces. On one side, a political system unable to solve deep structural inequality. On the other, criminal organizations too powerful to simply remove. And in the middle, ordinary citizens trying to survive day by day. But perhaps the most serious long-term threat is environmental destruction. Large parts of Colombia's rainforest are being destroyed at an accelerating rate. Illegal mining and coca cultivation are poisoning rivers, erasing forests, and turning entire regions into dead zones. Criminal groups now understand that illegal gold mining can generate even more profit than cocaine, with fewer international restrictions. So armed networks operate large mining operations deep inside the jungle. They use mercury and toxic chemicals that permanently contaminate soil and water systems. Indigenous communities suffer severe health problems, birth defects, and long-term poisoning. And the state still struggles to control vast territories. Every destroyed forest makes recovery harder. Every poisoned river reduces future viability. Every abandoned region increases criminal control. Because peace cannot grow on land that is physically being destroyed. External pressure adds another layer of instability. The collapse of Venezuela showed how quickly regional crises can spill into Colombia. Millions of refugees crossed the border in search of survival, creating enormous pressure on housing, employment, and public services. If similar crises repeat across the region, Colombia will face even larger waves of migration, unemployment, and social tension. Criminal networks thrive exactly in these conditions of desperation. At the same time, global drug demand remains unchanged. As long as wealthy consumers continue buying cocaine, production networks will always regenerate. Cartels may change names, leaders, or routes, but the system itself remains financially alive. This creates a terrifying structural reality. Even if Colombia weakens criminal groups locally, global demand continuously rebuilds them. That is why many analysts fear a future of permanent fragmentation. Not a single unified civil war, but a long-term breakdown into zones of influence. Cities partially controlled by gangs, rural regions governed by armed factions, politicians negotiating quietly with criminal actors, legal economies mixed with illegal money, millions of civilians living inside a permanent gray zone between state and crime. And most of the world would likely continue observing it from a safe distance, treating it as just another distant instability. But history shows that large-scale social collapse never stays contained forever. Migration spreads it, drugs spread it, arms spread it, economic shock spreads it, and Colombia is already deeply connected to global systems of consumption and trade. That makes its instability not just a national issue, but a global warning signal. Because Colombia is showing what happens when inequality, corruption, violence, and environmental destruction compound over decades without real structural repair. And the most frightening part is this: the country had everything to become stable and prosperous. Natural resources, strategic geography, agricultural richness, young population, modern cities. But instead of building long-term stability, it became trapped in a cycle of violence that consumes generation after generation. Now it resembles a massive pressure system, slowly accumulating energy. And nobody can predict exactly when it will release, because societies, like systems, have limits. And when millions of people reach the conclusion that nothing will ever change, the future stops being a promise. It starts looking like a threat. When the last plane leaves Bogotá and tourists return home with coffee beans, photos of colorful streets, and stories about adventure in Colombia, the country is left alone again with its real face. The music fades, the filters disappear, and what remains is a society carrying decades of unresolved violence and exhaustion. Colombia is not just a country affected by crime. It is a system that learned to function inside crime, a place where violence is no longer an exception, but part of the structure itself, where illegal economies, political power, and everyday survival are deeply intertwined. The most dangerous truth is that everything still keeps working. The cartels continue operating. The politicians continue making promises. The global market continues consuming drugs. Tourists continue consuming the myth, and ordinary people continue paying the price. The world prefers to watch Colombia from a safe distance, as if it were a dramatic TV show or a cinematic universe of narcos and jungle wars. But real societies do not stay contained inside entertainment formats forever. Pressure spreads, violence spreads, desperation spreads. Colombia today is a country built on contradictions so extreme that stability becomes almost impossible to maintain in the long term. On the surface, there are modern cities, international investments, and tourist districts that look safe and vibrant. But only a few streets away, different rules apply. Entire neighborhoods operate under armed control, where survival depends on knowing invisible territorial borders and obeying local power structures. This is not temporary instability. It has lasted for generations, and that is what makes it so dangerous. Because when violence becomes normal, people stop reacting to it. Death becomes statistical, fear becomes routine, corruption becomes expected, and slowly, society loses its emotional ability to resist collapse. At that point, even large tragedies no longer feel shocking. They become background noise. But underneath that surface calm, pressure continues building. Economically, millions of people survive in informal systems without protection. Politically, trust in institutions is extremely weak. Socially, inequality remains deeply embedded. Geographically, large regions are still outside full state control. And environmentally, vast territories are being destroyed for short-term profit. All of these systems are interconnected, and all of them are unstable. The most disturbing part is that almost every actor inside this system gains something from it, even if indirectly. Criminal groups profit from illegal economies. Corrupt officials profit from bribes and political protection. International consumers sustain the drug market. Legal industries are partially financed by illicit money. And even tourism profits from the aestheticization of violence. Meanwhile, the poorest citizens carry the entire emotional and physical cost of the system. This is why Colombia is not a simple failure of governance. It is a multi-layered structure where too many incentives depend on instability continuing. And that makes change extremely difficult. Even when reforms are introduced, they often collide with deeper forces. Economic dependence on illegal markets, territorial control by armed groups, and global demand for narcotics that never disappears. The result is a kind of frozen conflict, not always a visible war, but a permanent state of tension, fragmentation, and controlled chaos. In rural regions, state authority is replaced by armed organizations. In urban areas, parallel systems of power operate through gangs and informal economies. In elite districts, life continues almost normally, protected behind walls and security systems. These worlds coexist, but they do not integrate. They exist side by side, without ever fully merging into a single national identity. And that fragmentation is the core of the problem. Because nations survive when they share common rules, trust, and institutions. When those disappear, society stops functioning as a unified system and becomes a collection of separate realities living inside the same borders. Colombia is already close to that condition. The most frightening scenario is not sudden collapse. It is slow normalization of fragmentation, a future where parts of the country remain fully connected to global markets and modern infrastructure, while other parts remain permanently governed by armed actors and informal economies. A future where inequality is not just economic, but territorial, where geography itself decides your level of safety, opportunity, and even life expectancy. At the same time, global forces continue to push the system in the same direction. Demand for drugs remains stable in wealthy countries. Illegal mining remains profitable due to global commodity markets. Migration pressures remain high due to regional instability. And climate and environmental destruction continue weakening rural areas further. All of this creates a feedback loop, a system that keeps reproducing its own instability. And the most important psychological shift is already happening inside the population. Many young Colombians no longer believe in national transformation. They do not expect institutions to improve. They do not expect justice to become reliable. They do not expect the system to suddenly repair itself. Instead, they adapt individually. They focus on personal survival strategies, leaving the country, joining informal economies, or entering parallel power structures. That shift is perhaps the most dangerous of all, because when collective belief disappears, a society stops imagining a shared future. And without a shared future, there is no foundation for rebuilding anything at scale. Colombia today stands in that fragile space between endurance and exhaustion. It has not collapsed, but it has not healed either. It continues moving forward, but carrying the weight of all its unresolved contradictions. A country of extraordinary beauty, enormous resources, and deep cultural richness, trapped inside a system that constantly consumes its own potential. The final truth is uncomfortable but simple. Colombia is not waiting for a single catastrophic event. It is already living inside a slow, continuous form of structural pressure. And the longer it remains unresolved, the more unpredictable the outcome becomes. Because in systems like this, collapse is not always an explosion. Sometimes it is a long silence, a gradual fading, a normalization of what once seemed unthinkable, and the world keeps watching from a safe distance, slowly forgetting that what happens here rarely stays here forever.